In June of 1956, under the impression made by just having read the Khrushchev report, Deutsche observes, communists had for more than a quarter of a century bowed before a monstrous tyrant, vile at both the moral and intellectual level. How could all of this have happened? 934. Following that line of argument, he could have added, what had led illustrious Western philosophers and statesmen to pay tribute to that monster with approving and respectful statements and, in certain cases, even admiration? These questions are legitimate and even inevitable, but maybe they should be complemented by another. How could Deutsche have allowed himself to be affected by that behavior which he sharply condemned in 1956? Yes, after the end of World War II and on the occasion of Stalin's death, he would pay tribute to the statesman who had made a decisive contribution to the defeat of the Third Reich and had built socialism in the USSR. In that period, the abject and idiotic monster had not yet entered the scene, and therefore the doubts had not yet emerged over the enormous credit that he enjoyed, despite everything, for a long time. Maybe in 1956, Deutsche would have had a better response if he had asked a very different question, led by a generalissimo and by such a ridiculous political leader: how was the Soviet Union able to defeat the terrible Nazi war machine that had so quickly subjugated the rest of continental Europe? And how was the Soviet Union, starting from a position of extreme weakness, able to turn into a military and industrial superpower? Yes, looking closely, with half a century of distance from Stalin's death and the clamor of de-Stalinization, it's opportune to return to the question made by Deutsche to radically invert it: how did such a grotesque and absurd portrait like the one made by Khrushchev achieve the status of historiographical and political dogma? That dogma was even infused with new details, increasingly fantastical, following the revelations of the secret report that attributed to Stalin a blind confidence in Hitler's respect for the Non-Aggression Pact. Arendt, in the subsequent editions of The Origins of Totalitarianism, put together a theorem of the elective affinity between the two dictators, and that theorem identified an increasing number of points of contact and symmetries, until the two monsters become perfect equivalents in all aspects of their political action and ideology, including the consummation of a Holocaust and anti-Semitic hatred. The key to explaining that unique phenomenon can be found in the history of political mythologies. After Thermidor, the Jacobins are also put to the guillotine at the moral level. They become those sultans, those satyrs, who had nearly everywhere created places of pleasure and places for orgies in which they gave into all excesses. 935. In addition to sexual libido, what especially consumed Robespierre was libido dominandi. He was preparing to get married to Capet's daughter in order to ascend to the throne of France. 936. The accusation was undoubtedly sensational, but there was no lack of proof. They were even abundant. The marriage certificate had already been signed. Moreover, in the house of the recently executed tyrant were found a seal with the symbol of France and the dynastic seal of the House of Bourbon. 937. The execution or the murder of Louis XVI can now be seen in new light. The man responsible for that act had perhaps only intended to rid himself of a rival. He wanted to eliminate the obstacle that prevented him from ascending to the throne. The moral decapitation of Robespierre was linked to the more specifically intellectual decapitation. During the Jacobin period, popular episodes, not promoted from above, of vandalism and revolutionary iconoclasm take place that targeted the symbols of the old regime. Such episodes continued to arise during Thermidor, this time having in mind everything that recalled the terror. But the new rulers accused the Jacobins of the following: out of hatred for the culture they were totally deprived of, they had planned to burn libraries, and they had already put that crazy plan into action. Over the course of various passages, the list of accusations grows ever larger and becomes an ever more uncontroversial fact to the degree it loses all contact with reality. Boissy d'Anglas can subject the Jacobins to public derision by affirming, Without a doubt, these ferocious enemies of humanity would have momentarily shown their villainy only under the light of the libraries burned, since they hoped that the darkness of ignorance would extend even further. Barbarians. They have set the human spirit back many centuries. 938 The Jacobins had introduced mandatory schooling, and against them and against the French Revolution itself the counter-revolutionary propaganda did not tire in denouncing the hubris of reason, and on the contrary celebrating the beneficial function of prejudice. But in the ideological and political atmosphere of Thermidor, Robespierre and his collaborators are accused of having sought to spread the darkness of ignorance. And the new accusation is made without even reconsidering the previous accusation. Logical coherence is the last of their concerns. Also, with regard to the terror's number of victims, one witnesses a process similar to that which was just seen with the libraries. Again we turn to the words of the eminent scholar that we continue to follow here: the numbers are not up for discussion, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, they even speak of millions. In summary, it's a matter of genocide, as denounced by the Jeunesse Dorée in their anti-Marseillaise anthem against the drinkers of the blood of humanity, that anthropophagic horde, those terrible cannibals. 939 It's an accusation taken up and radicalized by the left. Soon after Thermidor, Babeuf speaks of a process of depopulation carried out in the Vendée by Robespierre, who goes as far as to pursue the infamous, unprecedented political objective of wiping out the human race. 940 That is how we witness a convergence between the extreme right and the extreme left of the political spectrum, both agreeing to depict Robespierre as a genocidal monster. However, that paradox doesn't last long. It doesn't take Babeuf long to get to the real meaning of Thermidor. Before the judges that were prepared to condemn him to death, in denouncing the desperate situation to which the popular masses are condemned, he appeals to Saint-Just and his ideals for everyone's happiness and salvation from misery. On the other hand, he expresses his disdain for the system of hunger put into practice by the new rulers and classifies the Thermidorian Boissy d'Anglas as genocidal. 941 That is how the charge of genocide undergoes a radical reversal. It no longer targets Robespierre, but his victorious enemies. It would be interesting to make a comparative analysis of the mythologies that arise from the great revolutions. After October 1917, the Jacobin drinkers of human blood are substituted by the Bolsheviks who, according to refugees in the U.S. from Soviet Russia, had invented and frantically used an electric guillotine capable of killing 500 men per hour. We saw the Jacobins branded as people who frequented places of pleasure and organized orgies. In October of 1919, the Hungarian communist leader, Béla Kun, is accused of having established a harem with a lavish assortment of women, where the perfidious and insatiable Jew could rape and dishonor dozens of virgins of the Christian caste. 942 Repeating this slander is a newspaper that will later become the official press organ for the Nazi Party, but at that time, in expressing its horror over the events in Eastern Europe, shares an outlook that's widespread in Western public opinion and on both sides of the Atlantic. In America, too, the Bolsheviks are synonymous with debauchery and moral depravity. In Russia they had introduced the nationalization of women, as charged by documents published with the authorization of President Wilson and as was described in rich detail by an authoritative newspaper like the New York Times. Yes, every girl upon turning 18 years old is forced to register in an office of free love, and then sadly turned over to a man arbitrarily chosen, and she is forced to suffer on her body and soul the governmental entities' impositions. 943 If the Jacobins are barbarians, even more so are the protagonists of the October Revolution, first classified as agents of Imperial Germany, or the Huns and the Vandals, as Germans are defined by Entente propaganda during World War I, and later as the agents of Jewish internationalism, even more alien to true civilization, both for their geographic origin, as well as the support provided to the colonial revolts and to the peoples of color, just as Nazi propaganda insisted on repeating. Finally, while Robespierre is for some time accused by Babeuf of having wanted to completely wipe out the human race, Conquest is satisfied in blaming Stalin for organizing the starvation of the Ukrainian people. The topics sketched out here are only modest suggestions for the future historian. In looking for the appropriate comparison for these political mythologies, it's worthwhile, at any rate, to observe that Stalin was less fortunate than Robespierre. Yes, in Russia today there are popular demonstrations that raise his portrait, and the majority of adults have a positive view toward Stalin and see in him the energetic leader the country needed in such calamitous times. Among the ex-dissidents we see Alexander Zinoviev classify Yeltsin as the leader of a criminal counter-revolution and a colonial democracy, and he makes a surprising overall evaluation of the history of the Soviet Union, including the 3 decades of the Stalin era. Thanks precisely to communism, Russia was able to avoid even greater evils and to realize, in extremely difficult historical circumstances, advancements that only a cynical rabble can deny. 944 In the West, however, including on the left, the charge of Stalinism can hit anyone who even dares to express any doubts or ask any questions. If anything, it's in the bourgeois camp where we can catch a timid glimpse at some reconsideration. Just a few months after the overthrow of the Soviet Union, an authoritative Italian newspaper reported, 1.5 million people run the risk of not surviving the winter, for lack of food and medicine throughout the Soviet Union, a report by the International Red Cross has stated. 945 Some time later, still analyzing Yeltsin's Russia, a prominent political scientist, Maurice Duverger, pointed to the falling average life expectancy, whose responsibility fell on the privileged minority that had managed to accumulate enormous wealth through parasitical speculation, though not explicitly illegal, and he denounced the true genocide of the elderly. 946 If not a reversal, at least the charge of genocide is applied to all sides, with the condemnation of one of the West's heroes, and with him the West itself, considered responsible for the tragedy that in no way took place in a situation of acute political and economic crisis, but after the Cold War itself had ended, at a time when, at least in the most advanced countries, shortages were only a distant memory. It comes to mind the summary made by Edgar Quinet regarding the French Revolution, quote, "The terror had been the first calamity, the second, that which ruined the Republic, was the trial conducted against the terror." 947 Uncle